Anna Miller knew the weight of things. She knew the weight of a full water bucket in each hand, the ache it sent up her arms and into the bones of her shoulders. She knew the weight of a sleeping child, limp and trusting against her chest, the scent of milk and wood smoke in their hair. She knew the weight of the 7 heartbeats that depended on her own, a constant, humming pressure beneath her ribs. And she knew the weight of the silence in the house after her husband, John, had been laid in the earth. It was a heavy, shapeless thing that settled in the corners and refused to be swept out with the dust. The farm was her inheritance and her sentence. 160 acres of Wyoming land that was stingy with its water and generous with its wind. John had seen promise in it. Anna saw work. The work was a constant. It started before the sun bruised the eastern horizon and ended long after the last child was asleep. There was the milking and the mending, the churning and the hoeing. There were the chickens to feed and the eggs to gather, the bread to bake in the big cast-iron stove, the endless laundry to be scrubbed on a grooved board until her knuckles were raw. Her hands were a map of this life. They were not the hands of the women in town, the merchant's wife or the banker's daughter. Her hands were broad and chapped, with calluses on the palms and dirt permanently etched into the lines around her nails. They were competent hands. They could soothe a fever, butcher a hog, set a fence post, and braid a daughter's hair with surprising gentleness. She was 34 years old, but some days she felt as ancient as the wind-scoured rocks that dotted her pastures. The people in the town of Redemption spoke of her in low, pitying tones. "That poor Anna Miller," they would say over the counters of the general store. 7 children. It's a tragedy. They saw her as a collection of her hardships. A widow, a mother of 7, a woman alone on a harsh piece of land. They saw her as a problem to be solved, or more often, a problem to be avoided. Suitors did not come calling. A woman with 1 or 2 children might be a manageable prospect. A woman with 7 was a cautionary tale. She was too much. Too tall, for one thing, standing nearly 6 feet, a trait that had always made her feel conspicuous. Too worn by work. And too full of children, each one a living, breathing testament to a life already lived with another man. Anna had accepted this. She did not waste time on bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury, like lace or sitting still. She had work to do. She had her children. Samuel, the oldest at 12, had his father's quiet nature and a man's sense of responsibility settling on his thin shoulders. Then came Martha, practical and stern at 10. Then the twins, Luke and Levi, always in motion, a whirlwind of scuffed boots and tangled limbs. Then gentle Sarah, then solemn Ruth, and finally little Caleb, who was only 2 and still smelled of the cradle. They were her world, a loud, demanding, beautiful world that left no room for loneliness to take root and fester. Most days, some evenings, after the last story was read and the last lamp was extinguished, she would stand on the porch and look out at the vast, empty dark. The sky was a spill of cold starlight. The wind whispered through the tall grass with a sound like a sigh. In those moments, the silence would return, heavier than ever. She would feel the shape of her solitude, a thing as real and solid as the house at her back. She had stopped expecting it to change. Hope, like bitterness, was an indulgence she could not afford. Her life was what it was. A straight, hard path she would walk alone, with 7 pairs of smaller feet trailing behind her. It was enough. She had told herself so 1,000 times. It had to be enough. The day Silas Kane came to her farm, the sky was the color of a faded slate, and the wind had a sharp edge that promised an early winter. Anna was splitting kindling by the woodshed, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. Her movements were efficient, born of long practice. She wasted no energy. She heard the horse before she saw it, a steady, unhurried tread on the dirt track that led to her gate. Visitors were rare. A neighbor returning a stray calf, or the preacher on his monthly round of outlying homesteads. She paused, axe in hand, and watched the rider approach. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, and he sat his horse with an easy stillness that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. He wore buckskins, worn and darkened with use, and his hair was long, tied back with a leather thong. He was not a man from the town. He had the look of the mountains about him, of high, lonely places. He stopped his horse at the fence and dismounted in one fluid motion. He did not call out a greeting. He simply stood there, waiting, his eyes taking in the farm. Anna felt the weight of his gaze. It was not the pitying glance of the townspeople, nor the assessing stare of a man looking to buy livestock. It was a quiet, thorough observation. He looked at the neat rows in her garden, covered now with burlap against the coming frost. He looked at the solid repair on the roof of the barn, a job she and Samuel had spent a week on. He looked at the clean-swept yard. She walked toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. She did not like the feeling of being inspected. "Can I help you?" Her voice was level, practical. The man nodded slowly. His face was weathered, his eyes a pale, clear gray, like the winter sky. They held no judgment, only a deep, unnerving calm. "I was told in town that you sell cured hams." His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Ido. I'd like to buy one." It was a simple transaction. Mundane. She led him to the smokehouse, a small, sturdy building that smelled of hickory and salt. The air inside was cool and still. Hams and long flitches of bacon hung from the rafters, each one perfectly cured, a testament to a skill John had taught her years ago. It was food for the winter. It was security. He looked at the hanging meat, his expression unreadable. He pointed to a medium-sized ham. "That one." She took it down from its hook. It was heavy in her arms. She wrapped it in clean muslin, her movements precise. He watched her hands as she worked, the way she tied the twine in a neat, secure knot. He seemed to notice everything. She named a price. It was a fair price, but not a cheap one. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and laid the coins in her palm without haggling. The metal was cold against her skin. He had what he came for. The transaction was complete. But he did not leave. He stood by his horse, the wrapped ham in his hand, and looked around the farmstead again. The twins, Luke and Levi, were chasing a chicken near the barn, their shouts echoing in the crisp air. Samuel was methodically turning the compost pile with a pitchfork, his small face serious with concentration. "Who runs this place?" the man asked. The question was unexpected. It was not idle curiosity. "I do," Anna said, her chin lifting slightly. He looked from the well-tended farm to her, then back again. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a nod of surprise or pity. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of recognition. In that simple gesture, Anna felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen. Not as a widow, not as a collection of burdens, but as the capable woman who stood before him. He tied the ham to his saddle. "My name is Silas Kane. Anna Miller." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then swung himself onto his horse. He looked at her once more, a long, steady look, and then he turned and rode away, leaving Anna standing by the gate with the feel of his strange, quiet attention lingering in the air like the scent of coming snow. She watched until he was a small, dark shape against the gray horizon. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something that was not resignation. It was curiosity, and it was a weight all its own. A week passed. The promised snow arrived, a light dusting that melted by noon, leaving the world clean and damp. Anna's days fell back into their familiar rhythm. The memory of the quiet man with the observant eyes faded, becoming just another small, strange event in a life that had little room for strangeness. She dismissed it. He was a trapper, a mountain man passing through. She would likely never see him again. Then, on a Saturday, he returned. He rode up to her gate just as he had before, his presence announced only by the sound of his horse's hooves. Anna was on the porch, mending one of Levi's perpetually torn shirts, a basket of work at her feet. She watched him dismount, a flicker of surprise disturbing her composure. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice betraying none of it. "Mrs. Miller," He stood at the gate again, holding the reins of his horse. He had a string of plump rabbits slung over his shoulder. "I came to see if you'd be willing to trade for some of that bacon." It was a fair request. Meat was meat, and his rabbits were fresh. She nodded. "I can do that." The exchange was made. She gave him a slab of bacon, and he handed her the rabbits. Again the transaction was finished, but again he lingered. His gaze roamed the farm. He noticed the barn door. One of its large iron hinges had been loose for months, causing the heavy door to sag and scrape against the ground. It was a job that required more strength than she or Samuel possessed to fix properly. It was on her long list of things that would have to wait. Silas looked at the sagging door for a long time. He said nothing about it. His eyes moved on, noting the way Martha, at 10, competently herded the younger children out of the mud and toward the house for their midday meal. He saw the order she imposed, a small echo of her mother's own. He finally spoke. "That ham was the best I've had in 10 years. It's my husband's recipe," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. She rarely spoke of John to strangers. Silas just nodded. He was a good man, then. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, derived from the evidence of the ham. The directness of it startled her. He left as quietly as he had arrived. But his visits became a pattern. Every week or so, he would appear at her gate with a trade. Pelts for flour, wild honey for jars of her preserved peaches, venison for smoked sausages. His reasons were always practical, his manner always reserved. He never overstayed. He never asked personal questions. But he always watched. He watched Samuel learn to handle an axe, his small frame struggling with the weight. He watched Anna's hands, never still, as she knitted or shelled beans or patched a worn quilt. He learned the children's names not by asking, but by listening. He saw the quiet resilience that held the farm together, the unspoken web of duty and affection that bound Anna to her children and her children to each other. One afternoon, Anna came out of the house to find him standing by the barn. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the sagging door. He ran a hand over the strained, rusty hinge, his touch gentle, assessing. He looked at the heavy timber, gauged its weight. Then he turned, saw her watching him, and gave his customary slow nod before mounting his horse and riding away. The next morning, the barn door was fixed. She discovered it at dawn on her way to the milking. The door, which had for months been a groaning, scraping trial to open, swung inward on silent, perfectly balanced hinges. It moved with an impossible lightness. She stopped, her milk pail dangling from her hand, and stared. The old, strained hinge had not been merely tightened. It had been removed, heated in a forge, and reshaped. The iron was clean and strong, the pins seated perfectly. It was the work of a skilled blacksmith. There was no sign of him, no note, just the silent, functional door. A problem she had carried in the back of her mind for a year was simply gone. It was an act of service so profound and so quiet that it left her breathless. He had seen a need and met it, without expectation of thanks, without any announcement at all. He had simply done the work. The town began to notice. His regular trips to the Miller farm did not go unremarked. When Silas went to the mercantile for supplies, George Alcott, the proprietor, leaned on the counter. "Making that trip out to the widow Miller's place pretty regular, I see," George said, his tone a mix of curiosity and warning. Silas set a bag of coffee beans on the counter. "She keeps good bacon." "That she does," George agreed, not letting it go. "But that's a heavy burden, Silas. A woman with 7 children. A man could get swallowed whole by a life like that." Silas looked at him, his pale eyes steady. "You see a burden," he said, his voice flat. "I don't." He paid for his coffee and left, leaving George Alcott to stare after him, perplexed. The story of the exchange made its way around town, as stories do. The women who had pitted Anna now watched her with a new kind of interest when she came to town for supplies. They saw the straightness of her back, the steady competence in her eyes. They saw the mountain man who sometimes rode beside her wagon for a mile or two on the road back to her farm. They began to wonder if they had misjudged Anna Miller. Or perhaps they had misjudged the nature of a burden. For Anna, Silas's quiet presence was becoming a part of the landscape of her life, like the mountains on the horizon. His acts of practical care continued. A stack of perfectly split firewood, far more than any trade would require, appeared by her back door. A weak section of fence was mended with new posts, sunk deep and solid into the earth. He never spoke of these things. When she tried to thank him for the firewood, he simply said, "Winter's coming. A house with children needs a hot fire." He deflected her gratitude as if it were an unnecessary complication. The work was the point. The action was the language he spoke. And Anna, a woman whose life was defined by action, understood it perfectly. The first real snow came in late November. It did not start as a blizzard, but as a quiet, determined fall of thick, wet flakes. The sky turned a uniform, pearly gray, and the world grew silent, insulated by the descending blanket of white. Anna and the children worked all morning, bringing in the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, securing the livestock in the barn, checking the seals on the windows. There was an urgency to their work. The feel of the air, the heavy stillness, promised this was no mere dusting. By midday, the wind began to rise. It moaned around the corners of the house and sent snow swirling in thick eddies. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. It was then that she saw him, a dark figure on horseback, materializing out of the white haze. It was Silas. His horse was laden with supplies, heavy canvas sacks tied behind the saddle. He wasn't heading to his cabin in the foothills. He was riding directly toward her. He dismounted at the gate, his shoulders already covered in a thick layer of snow. He didn't wait for an invitation. He began unlashing the supplies. "Storm's settling in," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact against the rising shriek of the wind. "Thought you might need an extra hand." He worked with a silent, focused efficiency that matched her own. He and Samuel secured a loose shutter on the hayloft. He checked the animals, ensuring they had enough feed and water to last a few days. He showed Luke and Levi how to bank the fire in the forge, a trick to keep the embers alive under a layer of ash, ready to be revived quickly. He moved about her farm as if he belonged there, his quiet competence a steadying presence against the fury of the storm. The children, who had been wary of him during his brief visits, began to orbit his calm center. He spoke to them not as a group but as individuals. He complimented Martha on her well-organized pantry. He showed Sarah how to carve a simple bird from a piece of scrap wood. He held little Caleb on his lap by the fire, the boy's head resting trustingly against the strange man's buckskin shirt. By nightfall, the farm was sealed tight against a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled, rattling the window panes, but inside, the house was warm and safe. The smell of stew filled the air. After dinner, the younger children, exhausted and content, were put to bed. Samuel sat at the table, carefully studying the bird Silas had carved, trying to understand the motions of the knife. Finally, only Anna and Silas were awake. The house was quiet save for the storm outside and the crackle of the fire. They sat at the big kitchen table, a comfortable silence between them. The lamp cast a warm, golden glow on his weathered face. "Thank you," Anna said, her voice soft in the stillness. "We would have managed, but it would have been harder." Silas looked at her, his gaze direct. The polite, distant manner he usually maintained was gone, replaced by a raw honesty. "Anna," he said, and the use of her first name felt both strange and deeply right. "I was not just helping with the storm." She waited, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She knew, somehow, that this was a turning point. The ground was shifting beneath her feet. "I have been coming here for a reason," he continued, his voice low and steady. "The bacon was an excuse. The trades were an excuse." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I came here to see you." The plain, unadorned truth of it hung in the air between them. It was not a declaration of love, not a flowery confession. It was a statement of intent, as solid and real as the timber of the house. Anna felt a lifetime of carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. She thought of all the reasons it was impossible. "Silas," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "I have 7 children. This farm is my entire life. I have nothing else. I have no time for calling." He did not flinch. His gray eyes were full of a profound understanding. "I see that," he said simply. "I see you wrestling this land into submission every day. I see you raising your children to be strong and decent. I see all the work. I see all the weight." He leaned forward slightly. "That is why I am here. I am not a boy looking for a pretty girl to dance with. I am a man who knows what is real." The truth he spoke was so clear, so piercing. It left no room for argument. He was not afraid of her life. He was drawn to it. He saw her strength not as a barrier, but as the very thing he valued. He let the silence settle again, giving her time. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "When the snow clears," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "would you permit me to come call on you properly, Anna Miller?" She looked at his hands, resting on the table. They were large, calloused, and capable, much like her own. They were the hands of a man who did the work. She met his gaze, and in the depths of his steady eyes, she saw not a storm, but a harbor. "Yes, Silas," she said. "Yes, I would." The blizzard lasted for 3 days. For 3 days, Silas Kane was a guest in Anna Miller's home. A quiet, steady presence that seemed to fit into the spaces her family had without crowding anyone. He was a rock against which the storm and the chaos of 7 children seemed to break and soften. He rose before dawn with her, his movements silent as he stoked the fire and fetched water from the well, the path already cleared by his shovel. He ate his meals at her table, listening more than he spoke, his gaze missing nothing. He settled disputes between the twins with a low word and a calm look. He helped Samuel with his sums, his large, rough finger tracing the numbers on the slate. He did not try to be a father. He was simply there, a man offering his strength and his time without condition. Section Anna watched him. She watched the way he moved, with a purpose and economy that she recognized in herself. She saw the way little Caleb, who was shy with all strangers, would toddle over and try to climb into his lap. She saw the respect in Samuel's eyes as Silas showed him how to properly sharpen a knife on a whetstone. This was the beginning of their courtship, though it felt less like a courtship and more like a quiet, deliberate building. When the snow finally stopped and the world emerged, clean and white and silent, Silas cleared a path to the barn and ensured the animals were well before he prepared to leave. "I will be back on Sunday," he said to her at the door. It was not a question. It was a promise. And he was. That Sunday and every Sunday after, Silas would ride down from his cabin in the foothills. He never brought flowers or poems. He brought practical things. He brought a new leather strap to replace the one that had broken on the water pump. He brought a brace and bit and spent the afternoon securing the loose floorboards in the loft where the boys slept. He brought his knowledge and his labor, and he offered them freely. Their time together was spent in shared work. They mended fences side by side, the rhythm of their hammers falling into a steady, companionable beat. They cleared a new patch of ground for a larger garden, their shovels biting into the rocky soil. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch while the children played in the yard, and they would talk. He told her of his life in the mountains, of the profound silence and the harsh beauty. He spoke of the years he had spent alone, not out of loneliness, but out of a need for stillness. He had thought it was the life he was meant for. "I was wrong," he said one evening, watching the sun set behind the distant peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A man can get used to being alone. He can forget what it is to have a center. This place, he gestured to the house, the farm, the children, this is a center. Anna, in turn, found herself speaking of things she had kept locked away. She told him about John, about their shared dreams for the farm. She spoke of her fears in the days after his death, the crushing weight of responsibility, and her quiet determination to not fail. She did not speak for sympathy. She spoke to be understood. And Silas understood. He listened with an unwavering attention that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. He did not offer platitudes or easy comforts. He simply listened, and in his listening, she felt a profound sense of validation. One afternoon, he brought a horse for her. It was a sturdy mare, calm and well-tempered. "Your wagon horse is getting old," he said, by way of explanation. "This one is younger. She has a smoother gait." He had noticed. He had noticed the way she sometimes favored her back after a long ride into town. He had seen the need and, as was his way, he had met it. They rode together, exploring the edges of her property. He showed her which plants were good for medicine and which berries were sweet and safe to eat. He taught Samuel how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth by the creek. He was slowly, patiently, weaving his life into theirs. One evening, sitting on the porch steps as twilight settled, he put into words what she had come to feel. "The folks in town," he said, his voice a low rumble, "they look at you and they see 7 burdens. They think you are a woman who has lost everything." He shook his head slowly. "I think they have it backwards." He turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious in the fading light. "I look at you, and I see a woman who has built a kingdom out of grit and love. A woman who can raise 7 children and run a farm on her own is not a burden. She is a fortress." Tears pricked at Anna's eyes, hot and sudden. No one had ever seen her strength as her defining quality. They saw only her struggle. But Silas saw the victory within the struggle. He saw her. He saw her clearly. Spring came. The land, which had been locked under snow and frost, began to soften and breathe again. The creek swelled with melted snow, and the first green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth. It was a season of new beginnings, and a sense of possibility hung in the air, as sweet as the smell of wet soil. The courtship had settled into a comfortable routine. Silas was no longer a visitor. He was a part of the farm's rhythm. His presence was woven into the fabric of their days. The children no longer asked when he was coming. They simply expected him, as they expected the sun to rise. One morning in late April, they were working together in the newly plowed field. The air was cool, but the sun was warm on their backs. They were planting potatoes, moving down the long furrows. Anna would drop the seed potatoes, and Silas would follow behind, covering them with a hoe. Samuel and Martha worked on the next row over, their movements mimicking those of the adults. It was quiet, steady work. The only sounds were the scrape of the hoes against the earth, the call of a meadowlark, and the distant shouts of the younger children playing near the house. Anna felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost startling. This was what it felt like to not be alone in her labors. This was partnership. They reached the end of a row and stopped, standing at the edge of the field. They looked back at the work they had done, the neat lines of disturbed earth holding the promise of a future harvest. The soil smelled rich and alive. Silas leaned on his hoe and looked at her. The sun caught the weathered lines around his eyes. His expression was serious, yet calm. He did not seem nervous, only resolved. "Anna," he said, his voice steady. He did not reach for her hand. He did not kneel. He stood before her as an equal, a partner in the work they had just completed. "I would like to build a life with you," he said, the words simple, direct, and freighted with meaning. He glanced toward the house, where the children's laughter drifted on the breeze. "With all of you." He looked back at her, his gaze holding hers. "Will you marry me?" The question was not a surprise. In some ways, she felt she had been waiting for it since the day he fixed her barn door. It felt like the final, logical step on a path they had been walking together for months. Her carefully built walls of self-sufficiency had been dismantled not by a grand assault, but by the patient, steady application of kindness and respect. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. A bit of her dry wit, which she so rarely showed, surfaced. "Silas Kane," she said softly. "I was beginning to wonder if you would ever ask." Relief and a deep, quiet joy washed over his face. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, simple ring. It was a plain band of gold, worn smooth with time. "It was my mother's," he said. "It's all I have of her." He took her hand, her large, work-roughened hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. Fit perfectly. It looked as if it had always been there. Their wedding was as simple and practical as they were. They rode to town in the wagon, the children scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best, their faces a mixture of excitement and solemnity. The ceremony took place in the circuit judge's office. It was a small, dusty room that smelled of old paper and stale tobacco. The town was there. Not all of them, but many. George Alcott stood in the back, his arms crossed, a look of grudging admiration on his face. The women who had once whispered pitying words now watched with a kind of wonder. During the short ceremony, little Caleb began to fuss. Without a word, Silas reached down and lifted the boy into his arms. He held him, his large hand gently patting the child's back, as he said his vows. He pledged his life not just to Anna, but to the entire world she carried. They did not have a reception. They went back to the farm. Anna cooked a large meal, and they all sat around the big kitchen table. Their family. It no longer felt like Anna and her 7 children, with Silas as a guest. Felt whole, complete. That evening, after the children were asleep, Anna and Silas stood on the porch. The same porch where she had stood alone for so many nights, feeling the weight of her solitude. Tonight, she did not feel alone. She felt the solid presence of the man beside her, a quiet strength that mirrored her own. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "I see you, Anna," he whispered, his voice rough against her ear. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I see you too, Silas." It was enough. It was everything. 5 years passed. The land, under their combined efforts, yielded its bounty. The farm thrived. The 160 acres that had once been a sentence now felt like a kingdom. Silas, with his deep, quiet knowledge of the land, had helped Anna make it prosper in ways she had only dreamed of. They had dug a new well, built a larger barn, and cleared another 20 acres for planting. The house had grown, too. A new wing had been added, built from timber Silas had felled and milled himself. It was filled with the sounds of a large and happy family. The children were growing, stretching toward the sky like healthy young saplings. Samuel, now 17, was a tall, capable young man who worked alongside Silas, his respect for his stepfather deep and abiding. Martha, at 15, managed the household with an efficiency that rivaled her mother's. The twins were still a whirlwind of energy, but now that energy was channeled into the endless work of the farm. And there was a new addition, a little girl named Hope, with Anna's dark hair and Silas's calm, gray eyes. She was the anchor that tied the two halves of their family together, a living symbol of their union. Anna's life was no longer a daily struggle for survival. It was a life of building. She was no longer just a widow, but a wife, partner. The weight of things had not disappeared, but it was now a shared weight, and therefore infinitely lighter. One late summer afternoon, she sat on the porch, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl in her lap. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of hay and dust. She watched her family spread out across the farmstead. Silas was in the paddock with Luke and Levi, teaching them how to mend a harness. His movements were patient, his voice low and calm as he explained the purpose of each tool. He was not a man of many words, but his actions had taught her sons more about integrity and quiet strength than any sermon could. Samuel was in the newly cleared field, guiding the plow behind a team of steady horses, his shoulders broad and strong. He moved with a confidence that made Anna's heart ache with pride. Martha and Sarah were tending the garden, their heads bent together as they weeded the long rows of beans and squash. Ruth was on the porch swing, a book in her lap, while little Hope toddled in the yard, chasing a butterfly. It was a scene of ordinary domestic peace. But to Anna it was a miracle built of hard work, patience, and the courage of a quiet man who had been willing to see what no one else could. She remembered the first day he had come to her farm, a stranger from the mountains, asking to buy a ham. She remembered the startling clarity of his gaze, the way he had looked at her not with pity, but with recognition. He had seen the fortress, not the burden. He had seen the life she had painstakingly built, and instead of being intimidated, he had simply stepped inside and added his strength to hers. He looked up then, as if he could feel her watching him. His eyes met hers across the yard. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, a smile that was just for her. She smiled back, a deep, contented happiness welling up inside her. She thought of the townspeople, of their shock and their whispers. "He'll take her and all 7 children?" They had asked each other in disbelief. They had seen it as a man taking on an impossible load. They could not understand that Silas had not seen a deficit. He had seen abundance. He had seen a home that was already full of life and love, and he had known, with a certainty that defied all conventional wisdom, that it was where he belonged. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Anna finished her peas and set the bowl aside. She leaned her head back against the post, the familiar, comforting sounds of her family washing over her. The weight she carried now was the good weight of a full life, a shared life, a life that had, against all odds, become more than enough. It had become everything.